Okay, the Subcommittee on Energy and Climate Grid Security will now come to order. Chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. First off, thanks for being here today. Great audience, and look forward to the panelists as we delve into this issue. So let me begin by welcoming everyone to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security field hearing, Enhancing America's Grid Security and Resilience. As a subcommittee chairman, I'm excited to be here in Moore County, North Carolina with my colleagues at the invitation of my good friend and colleague on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Representative Richard Hudson. There's no better member of Congress. The Energy and Commerce, except for myself. The Energy and Commerce Committee exercises broad jurisdiction over federal agencies and issues related to America's electric grid. As part of these responsibilities, we work closely with the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC, to ensure that our electric grid and the utility companies that operate it are well coordinated and prepared to address all hazards to the electric grid, whether they be severe weather events, physical, or cybersecurity threats. America's power grid is the world's most complex and highly interconnected system in the world. The challenge of protecting it is immense, and it's growing, especially as our power mix shifts and we add more and new and varied generations to that mix. According to the Energy Information Administration, our nation's power grid consists of more than 7,300 power plants, 160,000 miles of high-voltage power lines, millions of miles of low-voltage power lines, and more than 50,000 substations where transformers convert raw electricity to higher or lower voltages. Historically, natural events, especially severe weather events, present the greatest risk to the system's reliability and resilience. However, we are also facing a growing threat of physical and cyber attacks to our electric grid and other energy infrastructure like pipelines and electric substations. There have been several grid security incidents that have occurred recently that we're examining as part of our oversight responsibilities. Within the last year, we've seen electrical transmission substations attacked in Tacoma, Washington, and right here in Moore County. Both of these attacks resulted in blackouts that affected tens of thousands of people for multiple days. Prior to these instances, we saw one of the nation's most critical pipelines, the Colonial Pipeline, suffer a cyber attack that created fuel shortages and price spikes that lasted for weeks. As member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, we are taking a close look at these incidents to gather lessons learned and determine whether federal laws or regulations should be revised to enhance grid security and resilience. We're also gathering the perspectives of the electric industry and state partners to learn how we can harden our grid, improve situational awareness, and enhance grid security, and support the response efforts. With that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing before us today. I look forward to learning more about the substation attack that occurred here in Moore County so I can share the lessons learned with electric utilities and state officials in my home state of South Carolina and others across the country with my colleagues back in Washington. So I'd now like to recognize your congressman from North Carolina, Richard Hudson, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a day we've been looking forward to for a long time. I want to thank all the folks in the audience who are here today. I want to thank my colleagues for making this trip to my home here in the beautiful Sand Hills. I want to thank Chairman Jeff Duncan for your leadership. I want to thank our witnesses for making time to be here today. We really look forward to your testimony. And I think the testimony we're going to hear today is really going to set the table for a national discussion on grid vulnerability. And I'm proud that this discussion begins in my home here today with my friends and neighbors here part of this. We just this morning toured the site of one of the substations that was attacked, and I wanted my colleagues to see the sophistication of that attack and understanding the larger implications that plays into the vulnerabilities of our total grid. And I think we can learn from what happened here what could happen somewhere else if a more sophisticated, or a larger scale attack of this sophistication ever were to happen. There's a number of VIPs in the audience, and I'm going to get in trouble I start naming some of them, but I have to single out our sheriff, Ronnie Fields, for your incredible leadership, and particularly the way you've stepped up, and you and your deputies working with local law enforcement throughout this. Thank you, sir, for the incredible job you do every single day.
Is your mic on?
My mic on? Oh, wow.
I thought I was speaking loud.
Let there be light. That's a little too loud. I'm not going to start over, but thank you, Sheriff. Also, Senator Tom McGinnis, thank you for your leadership on the state level in the state Senate. I see Neil Jackson, our representative, and Ben Moss. They've been working really important legislation. In fact, I think the governor today is signing legislation that y'all worked on to increase penalties for attacks like this. I think that's really important. I'm going to get in trouble, but I know the chairman of our county commissioner, Nick Pacerno, is here, and a number of our commissioners. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here today. We've got our Mayor John Strickland of Pinehurst. Thank you for being here, sir. I see a number of members of the village council. Mayor Bob Farrell from Aberdeen, I understand, is here. Taylor Clement is here representing the city of Southern Pines. Thank you. Mike Harden, our district attorney. We went to separate high schools together. We've known each other a long time. Thank you for your leadership. I could go on and on. There's so many dignitaries and people here who have shown great leadership throughout this. Thank you for being here with us today. Again, as I said early this morning, we toured the substation that was one of the sites of one of the attacks on December 3rd, leaving my home and 45,000 of my neighbors without power for, in some cases, almost a week. In the aftermath of this attack, our hospital was impacted, threatening medical treatment. Schools were shut down. Businesses were affected. Stoplights went dark. Gas stations were closed. Cell signal was impacted. Water couldn't be heated. Our region suffered millions of dollars in damage, and right before Christmas holiday. It really made the hundreds of pounds of deer meat that I lost in my freezer seem pretty insignificant. But we felt that. An attack like this could have devastated our community, and we didn't go without our struggles. But overall, I am so proud of the resilient response of the people of Moore County in the days and weeks that followed these attacks. The people here truly showed the best of Moore County, the best of North Carolina, and the best of our nation. Community groups stepped in and ensured our vulnerable neighbors weren't left without access to critical care and resources. Within hours, churches like First Baptist Church of Aberdeen and First Baptist Church of Pinehurst and the Yates Thagard Baptist Church offered shower, laundry, and meal services. Harris Teeter offered free ice for folks for medicine and food. Staff and volunteers of the Boys and Girls Club of the Sand Hills partnered with our food bank to prepare 800 care packages. Our fire and rescue, police department, and library opened up their doors for folks to access the internet and to charge their phones and devices. All throughout, I'm grateful for the tireless and heroic efforts of the workers of Duke Energy and local providers, including Randolph Electric Membership Corp., Lee Electrical Construction, and Pike Electric, who worked tirelessly in the cold, 24/7, in the dark, under tremendous stress to get these substations back online. Thank you for your incredible commitment to our community. It's inspiring to see how everyone came together in our time of need, and I want to reiterate my many thanks to all those who assisted during this time. Again, I want to recognize our Sheriff, Ronnie Fields, for his incredible response and his leadership working with local law enforcement, and for continuing to follow up on tips and leads to determine who's responsible for December's attack. I share the community's frustration that we still haven't found those responsible. But in Washington, I've worked with the Select Committee on Intelligence to coordinate classified briefings from the FBI on their assessed threat, not only in this case, but the overall threat to our grid. I'll continue to push the FBI to make these attacks a priority and to make sure that the appropriate information sharing occurs and the cooperation with our local law enforcement so that those responsible can be held accountable. Since the attack occurred, I've been in listening mode. I've heard from constituents, from our grid operators, from community developers, and business owners who have concerns about our grid security and resilience, all against the backdrop of historic high energy costs. I share your concerns. That's why, as I promised in the days following the attack, I brought Washington to Moore County. I want to show my colleagues who are here today not just the numbers and facts, but the people personally affected and to hear their experiences. Everyone needs to know the full impact of this kind of an attack, the urgent need to address vulnerabilities that this exposes in our grid. There are 45,000 stories of why Moore County and our nation need greater grid resilience. Now we have the opportunity to hear from experts in the industry and those who call North Carolina home on the current state of our grid security and how we move forward from these attacks. My colleagues and I welcome these testimonies to help us do our jobs effectively. And I can guarantee you, when we head back to Washington to work, our critical energy transmission infrastructure and what vulnerabilities exist will be at the forefront of our conversations. So I thank my colleagues for being here today. I thank our witnesses again for making the time. We look forward to the discussion that's going to follow. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his statement, and that concludes members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be part of the record. I want to echo my colleague and thank Duke Energy and really all the utilities that are involved in how to do these things. But this was a Duke Energy site, and we thank them for their work with us. I also want to thank Sheriff Fields and the information you provided, and my longtime friend, Senator Tom McGinnis. And I'll applaud the legislature in North Carolina for the work you've recently done that's going to be signed into law today that addresses the penalties for these type attacks. So thanks to the North Carolina legislature for that. I want to remind the crowd this is an official congressional oversight hearing. It's not a town hall. We're going to operate it like an official hearing and ask you to just listen as participants and let us do our work. So I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before the subcommittee. I'm going to introduce you, and then you'll be recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Mark Eista, Managing Director of Enterprise Security for Duke Energy Corporation. Mr. Will Ray, Director of Emergency Management for the state of North Carolina. Mr. Tim Ponsetti, Vice President of Operations for the SERC Reliability Corporation. And Mr. Jordan Kern, Assistant Professor at North Carolina State University. Go Tigers.
Come on, Chairman. Come on.
So, per committee custom, each witness will have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and followed by a round of questioning from the members. And there's some lights in front of you, I think. Green will designate when we start. When it gets to yellow, you need to start kind of wrapping up. When it gets to red, your 5 minutes is up. We're not going to hear directly to 5 minutes, but just wrap up there so we can be on time. And so now I recognize Mr. Eista for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Duncan and members of the subcommittee. My name is Mark Eista, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today representing Duke Energy, where I serve as the Managing Director of Enterprise Security. I have more than 27 years' experience as a law enforcement officer, including almost 22 years at the FBI. For the past 4.5 years, I have been applying that experience at Duke Energy. We're one of the largest energy holding companies in the nation, serving 10 million electric and gas customers across 7 states in the Southeast and the Midwest, and our customers depend on us for an essential service. We know how critical it is that we provide our customers and communities with reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean energy, and our comprehensive security strategy is a part of that commitment. In my role, I'm responsible for the safety and security of nearly 28,000 employees, as well as the thousands of assets that we have in the field. My team oversees all aspects of security, including physical access control systems, uniformed security officers, threat intelligence, and more. Duke Energy has always had a robust security strategy to deter attacks and respond quickly as they occur. And that approach is much more than just physical security barriers and defenses. Our multi-layered security strategy includes protective barriers, monitoring and control capabilities, and a cross-functional team assessing threats 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We also partner with industry peers and engage in daily intelligence sharing with law enforcement at all levels. The strategy is always evolving as we evaluate new and emerging threats and expand our partnerships. We're all here today because on the night of December 3rd, 2 Duke Energy substations in Moore County were attacked, cutting power to 45,000 customers. The repairs were extensive, and Duke Energy had crews doing 24-hour shifts, working through multiple repair paths and replacing several large and important pieces of equipment in order to restore service. We appreciate how patient our customers were, and we saw incredible support from the local community during this extended and challenging outage. We continue to work with the FBI and local law enforcement on their investigations into the attacks in Moore County. We've also taken steps to enhance our security strategy in the wake of the attacks. I'd like to share with you some of the measures that we've taken. Immediately after the attacks, we increased monitoring capabilities at our substations in Moore County. And over the last 6 months, we've done a comprehensive review of our electric assets across our 6-state territory. As a result of our review, we're shifting from a tiered ranking system focused largely on an asset's impact to the bulk electric system to a tiered approach with a greater focus on potential impact to customers. It's through this lens we've identified opportunities to increase security and surveillance, and we're developing implementation schedules for this work. We're also improving our processes and rapid response protocols for essential equipment and personnel. We've identified critical parts with long lead times that may be needed for repairs to essential equipment, and we're working to strategically locate those parts to be available for rapid deployment. We've embarked on a plan to train chief law enforcement officers across our 6-state footprint on threats to the grid and how they can better protect it. We will continue exploring opportunities for additional improvements in the future, even as we execute on those upgrades today. But we understand that even with a robust strategy of deterrence and monitoring, no utility can completely eliminate the risk of an attack. That's a reality of operating an electrical system that extends across nearly 100,000 square miles and includes thousands of substations and millions of components. And is why we firmly believe grid resiliency must be a part of the conversation. The same self-healing technology that can detect outages from storms, isolate problems, and reroute power to restore service to customers can also help mitigate the impact of an attack on the grid. Investments in resiliency are a critical part of the $75 billion in grid improvements Duke Energy has planned for its electrical utilities over the next decade. With an electric grid that spans multiple states, Duke Energy does not believe that grid security mandates containing a one-size-fits-all approach would lead to better protection, affordability, or reliability for our customers. We look forward to taking part in the conversation and working with Congress on how best to deter attacks, protect our infrastructure, bolster our supply chain to more quickly replace critical equipment, and recover faster from attacks and other adverse events. With that, I welcome your questions.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize Director Ray for 5 minutes.
Morning, Chairman Duncan, Representative Hudson, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the state of North Carolina. Broadly, critical infrastructure protection is a vital piece of our overarching homeland security enterprise. As we continue to see the types of threats, hazards, and incidents emergency management and public safety agencies nationwide are having to prepare for and respond to increase both in frequency and in complexity. The intersection and integration of the traditional emergency management and the Homeland Security enterprise continues to grow in importance. As the team here in North Carolina has reviewed some of the recent incidents, there are 4 areas that we'd like to highlight as a part of our evaluation today. First is the importance of partnership. In emergency management, we utilize a whole-of-community approach as we execute our all-hazards mission. I cannot overstate the importance of partnerships here in North Carolina to do that effectively. Regardless of incident type or need, it takes public sector, private sector, nonprofits, and volunteer agencies at all levels, federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial, to effectively work through the continuum of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. This concept is not simply a talking point or a platitude, but a strategy that is central to what we do here. At every level of the response for the December incident, partnerships were key, whether facilitating movement of equipment for power restoration in feeding or addressing the needs of those impacted, or as we've moved through the investigation. Relationships fostered and developed pre-incident have been and continue to be essential to enhancing and improving what we do in emergency managers. Second, information sharing protections. As I've said, the private sector is an essential part of preparedness and response. The percentage of the Department of Homeland Security defined critical infrastructure sectors owned by the private sector is significant. We must evolve and recognize that, public or private, we need the members of those 16 sectors at the table and in partnerships in which they can be fully transparent. Part of the value of the emergency management and Homeland Security enterprises is we come largely without a regulatory role. The information sharing protections currently in place do not adequately support open, honest, and transparent dialogue between public and private sector, and we must be able to work together in an environment that addresses the needs of both public and private sector in that information and intelligence sharing. Current federal and state information sharing and intelligence protections do not fully address the need for open dialogue while protecting the parties engaged, as well as limiting information sharing due to classification requirements. Third would be related to preparedness funding levels and needed flexibility. Many states, including North Carolina, heavily rely on federal funding from the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to support critical infrastructure protection program execution. Federal funding levels have largely plateaued, accompanied by an increasing requirement to fund various national priorities with that limited funding. While we certainly acknowledge the importance and the validity of those national priorities, those do not always translate to meet the specific needs of the states, locals, tribes, or territories. By forcing states to adopt those strict and specific spending targets, funding is not as effective as it can be. We have incredibly smart and competent emergency management and Homeland Security professionals in states across this nation, and we should trust the abilities of those individuals to make the best choices for their respective state or jurisdiction. Finally, we want to highlight some of the authority challenges. Currently, the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act is the major governing authority for federal disaster response and recovery. By extension, this act has influenced many of the state disaster declaration authorities in place across this nation. Currently, this federal act is not structured in a way that can support response and recovery for incidents such as the recent Moore County event standing on its own. It is still largely focused on the impacts of a large-scale natural hazard event. If we're going to support the emergency management and Homeland Security apparatus across this country in responding to consequence management needs of communities and individuals in need, we need a modernized Federal Disaster Relief Act. We know that FEMA and other agencies in the federal family have and will continue to support response as they are able and will fully engage under their existing authorities, but the significant gap will be in the lack of ability of federal and state governments to support critical recovery efforts for communities that are experiencing significant impacts. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge the men and women of Moore County. During the incident in December, the response was a demonstration of this whole-of-community approach we talked about at the beginning. Public, private, nonprofit, and volunteer, coordinating to meet the needs of their community. We are incredibly proud of this community and their resilience. On behalf of the state of North Carolina, thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for highlighting the importance of critical infrastructure protection as an integral part of our Homeland Security strategy and enterprise. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for his statement. I now go to Mr. Ponsetti. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Duncan, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Tim Ponsetti, VP of Operations at CERC, headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I really appreciate the opportunity to provide CERC's perspective on grid security and resilience. As someone who spent the better part of my career working to keep the lights on in one form or another, I appreciate your focus on these critical issues. CERC is one of 6 regional entities that cover North America, working with and under the oversight of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, responsible for preserving and enhancing the reliability, resilience, and security of the bulk electric system. CERC is an independent resource for the industry, regulators, and policymakers. Our central mission is the effective and efficient reduction of risk to the bulk power system using all the tools and powers at our disposal. These tools include not only shining a light on key risks through outreach and training, but ensuring that the mandatory standards are followed and met through a regular cadence of audits and spot checks. And when they're not, we have a variety of enforcement and mitigation tools we can use as well, which include potential for significant fines for major program failures. Every year, CERC staff works with their technical committees, which include 1,500 industry subject matter experts, to identify the top regional risks facing our footprint. 30 are called out in our recent regional reliability report, and the top 10 highlighted. It's worth noting that the CERC team, along with its technical committee members, identified 7 common themes and emerging trends among all the risks, and I want to highlight 2 of those. First, security risks, both cyber and physical, are growing. And in the top 10, we have 4 that are in that area: supply chain, legacy architecture, exploiting cyber vulnerabilities, and extreme physical attacks like we saw in Moore County. Extreme weather is also a key risk to the CERC region, especially when coupled with the lack of situational awareness and lack of field diversity. Along with NERC and the regional policymakers here today, CERC shares a deep concern for the recent increase in physical attacks on electric infrastructure. While we've always seen substation break-ins for copper theft, we're seeing more and more attacks which exceed the threshold of criminal mischief and rise to the level of sabotage. Clearly, Moore County and the Seattle-Tacoma attacks, which resulted in outages last December, along with the plot that the FBI thwarted in Baltimore, have triggered growing concerns around the physical security of our electric infrastructure. Fortunately, the bulk power system has built into it extraordinary levels of redundancy, which enhances reliability and creates resilience. It takes widespread system damage, like from a hurricane, or tornadoes, or ice storms, or a target attack, like what happened in Moore County, to leave a large number of people in the dark for an extended period of time. FERC, NERC, and the regions are focused on the protection of bulk power system, generally defined as 100 kV and above on the transmission system, 75 megawatts and above from generation. Our focus is on the avoidance of large-scale reliability events, events that generally affect millions of people. That's the framework of SIP 14, which is the physical security standard for protecting the most critical transmission substations. Given the recent increase in physical attacks on the bulk power system, and shortly after the Moore County attack, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission ordered NERC to conduct a study to examine the effectiveness of the SIP 14 standard. This order directed NERC to address 3 questions: the adequacy of the criteria, the adequacy of the risk assessment, and whether a minimum level of physical protection should be established for all BPS transmission substations. At FERC's April 20th, 2023 meeting, Jim Robb, NERC's president and CEO, summarized that SIP 14 study. The study found the criteria and the risk assessments are adequate, but also identified additional actions and areas for further study. And as a next step, NERC and FERC are holding an open technical conference on August 10th in Atlanta to determine if further risk-based measures are needed in this area. In wrapping up my remarks, the impact of localized events, such as the Moore County incidents, are high profile and deeply concerning. As each of my 5 kids reminded me during COVID lockdown, while doing school from home every day online, reliable electric power and reliable internet service are now viewed as part of life's basic necessities. CERC is committed to working with its registered entities, policymakers, NERC, FERC, and others to ensure a highly reliable, resilient, and secure bulk power system in North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ponsetti. Dr. Ray, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
It's Kern, sorry. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. My name is Jordan Kern. I'm an assistant professor at North Carolina State University in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering. At NC State, I conduct research on bulk electric power systems. My group builds software that simulates the behavior of real-world systems, for example, the North Carolina grid, the Duke Energy grid, and/or the entire Eastern interconnection. We use these models to stress test systems' performance and explore how the vulnerability of the power grid might change in the future. My group's research is funded by the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, and many of my most consistent and productive collaborations are with national laboratories, especially Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. My group's research also frequently involves stakeholders in the electric power industry, including electric utilities, merchant power generators, system operators, and regulators. There are some important challenges for grid planners and operators in which I have comparatively little expertise, especially alongside these folks. These include global supply chains, cybersecurity and terrorism, and regulatory permitting and market reforms. I am more qualified to talk about the challenge of protecting the grid against more frequent and extreme weather, while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions to very low levels. More than 80% of major power outages, or outages affecting at least 50,000 people, are caused by extreme weather. This costs $25 to $75 billion per year in the form of damaged equipment and service outages. In order, the most damaging weather events to the grid are typically from severe thunderstorms, then winter weather, hurricanes and tropical storms, extreme heat, and then wildfires. Generation, high-voltage transmission, substations, and low-voltage distribution infrastructure are all vulnerable in different ways. Apart from economic costs, service interruptions pose life-threatening risks for people who depend on electricity-powered medical devices, and these risks can be exacerbated if power outages are associated with or occur at the same time as hazardous conditions like flooding, wildfire, or extreme temperatures. I am often asked how climate change will impact this dynamic, and the answer is it's different across the U.S. and somewhat uncertain, but risks for the grid that scientists are confident about include more intense hurricanes, more frequent and severe heat waves, and depending on the region, drought. Although there are a range of different technology pathways in which the U.S. can achieve adequate cuts in carbon emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, the lowest cost scenarios look likely to involve a lot more reliance on wind and solar. A growing number of tools are available for managing variability in wind and solar, and these include but are not limited to energy storage, flexible and interruptible demand, maintaining responsive generators as backup, increased transmission and coordination across system operators, and improved forecasting. Utility-scale renewable energy has been documented in some cases to perform well during periods of grid scarcity, and distributed solar in particular offers some unique capabilities for resiliency in remote areas. Nonetheless, tying a majority of the U.S. electricity supply to variable energy could alter the exposure of the grid to weather risk in important ways. For example, in my own research, I have observed that due to uncertainty in weather conditions, the amount of backup or firm capacity needed in grids decarbonized via wind and solar could be somewhat higher than what some national modeling studies have suggested. There are other important ways in which a rapid transition to clean energy could alter risks associated with extreme weather. For example, I worry that we don't fully understand the potential for reduced mobility of vulnerable communities during weather disasters if we largely electrify light-duty vehicle transportation in the U.S. One of the best ways to protect against some of these risks is to perform stress tests of our current systems and the systems we hope to build in the future. There are already established practices in place at utilities, system operators, and regulators to do this. However, as the grid expands into other economic sectors, as we add less controllable sources of generation to the mix, and as climate change alters the chance of extreme events occurring, I believe it is becoming more difficult to characterize the plausibility, let alone the likelihood, of different future scenarios and extreme events. And as a result, stress testing the grid is becoming more difficult to perform, and the results somewhat more difficult to interpret, even as the grid is becoming more and more important in the lives of Americans. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, Dr. Kern. I apologize for
No worries.
recognizing you wrongly a minute ago. This concludes opening statements of our panelists, and now we'll move into the question and answer portion of the hearing today. And so I want to start out with Director Ray. I want to thank you for being here, sharing the insights, and as a Director of North Carolina Emergency Management. And, you have many responsibilities, including coordinating the response and recovery to energy disruptions like we saw in December and energy blackouts. Were the lessons learned from the substation attack in December or aspects of the response and recovery that went well that we can take back with us to Washington?
Thank you for that question. And for your earlier introduction, I'll take the field promotion to doctor. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I really, truly can't overstate the partnership piece. And one thing that I did not expand upon in
Pull
my
that mic just a little bit closer. There's a lot of folks in here, and I want to make sure the TV and everybody can hear.
Certainly.
So.
Better. We have a long-standing practice here in North Carolina of blue sky partnership with all of the partners across the electric sector, to include Duke Energy as well as Dominion and the co-ops and some of our municipal providers. That's something that needs to continue to be incentivized, and that we have the latitude and ability to continue to do that. Here in North Carolina, the way we're structured from an emergency preparedness, response, and recovery standpoint, as you all know, everything begins and ends locally. This community is there responding to the incident well before we get there, and they will continue to deal with the impact of the incident well after anyone from the state leaves. I think that structure here in North Carolina, our ability to surge resources, whether it's people or equipment, into impacted jurisdictions, and having the authority to continue to do that, I think is going to continue to be key. The other piece of the lesson learned, I think, is some of what I spoke about in my statement. I think what would help continue to facilitate our ability to respond decisively to support our local jurisdictions is appropriate funding levels and flexibility to meet that expanding need as we talk about a very complex issue broadly of critical infrastructure protection. And then secondly, that we have the protections in place to be able to open and transparently talk with private sector partners at large about impacts they're seeing, as well as to be able to transfer and translate information from what is historically law enforcement into our private sector, obviously putting appropriate protections in place for tactics, methods, et cetera, but that we're able to provide actionable information to our local jurisdictions and our private sector partners to take appropriate steps.
Thank you for that. And I think the most valuable thing is just forward thinking, trying to anticipate these type of events before they do happen and how we can do that. But great answer. Mr. Eista, I don't believe there was a one-size-fits-all approach to harden the grid or electrical substations. We talked about that a little bit this morning. You mentioned in your written testimony that Duke is switching from a tiered ranking system focused largely on an asset's impact of bulk power system to a tiered approach with a greater focus on potential impacts to customers. Can you explain why this new approach is better and what does it mean in practice?
Yeah, Chair Duncan, thank you for that question. Every substation is unique. It's unique in its location, in its design, in its topography, and the customers it served. So this starts with tiering these substations with both their criticality to the bulk electric system, but also to those where there's customer impact. When I say customer impact, we're talking about those substations where we can't reroute power. So if there's a substation and it is taken out of service by a tornado or a hurricane or a threat actor, and we can field switch that power and the customers feel no impact, that is not a substation that we're going to focus on. We are going to focus on those substations like what you saw at West End this morning, where we cannot switch power. We have to use—
You say switch, you're just talking about rerouting, so there's no interruption.
Yes, sir.
Correct.
We cannot reroute power. So the customers don't care what route, what circuit their electricity comes on. They just want their lights on. So we start with having an intelligence-driven program. That is understanding what is the threat. Who are the threat actors? Why do they want to hurt the grid? What are their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures? Why? What is their level of maturity? And by understanding that, now we can start implementing controls on those bulk electric system assets and those assets where there is customer vulnerability. And we do that by utilizing a philosophy called defense in depth. You may have heard of defense in depth in the cyber security world. Well, we have the same thing in the physical security world, which is a series of overlapping security controls that allow us to have earlier detection of a threat actor, decrease our response time, and allow a quicker law enforcement response to be able to mitigate the attack. We talked about in West End today that was a very sophisticated attack.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go over time just a little bit, but according to the Energy Information Administration's website, it contains a tremendous amount of information about sensitive information, maps identifying locations of power plants and power lines. I don't want to give the bad guys a roadmap to attack our grid. Are you concerned about the amount of information that might be out there? And quickly, please, Mr. Eista.
Yes, sir. It is. We are concerned. It's not only on that website, but there are also other websites that threat actors have used to identify targets to
Are y'all
attack.
starting to remove that data from your website? Is Duke Energy addressing that? I'm sure we're going to be talking to the Energy Administration about that as well.
We do not have that level of data on our Duke Energy
Okay.
website.
Good. All right, thank you. I now recognize my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Is this on? Okay. Thank you all for this. Mr. Ray, thank you for your excellent testimony. I think we have one of the, if not the best emergency management state organization in the country. Thank you for your great work and the folks over there. Unfortunately, it's because we've had a lot of practice with hurricanes and other issues. But as you mentioned, there's a difference between a power outage and a storm response. I don't have time now, but I want to get into the information sharing issue too. I think that's a major issue you've raised that this committee needs to address. But on the issue of authorities in particular, I would say two-part question. One, what are the security gaps and challenges associated with delivering an emergency response during a blackout as opposed to a storm? But number two, what are the new authorities or different authorities you need to be able to address this type of a threat?
Thank you for that question. And first, I will say I'm privileged to be in my role and work alongside the men and women of North Carolina Emergency Management every day. We are a 300-strong, small but mighty organization, and really value the work that they do every day. I'll take the second part of your question first. I think a couple of things. One, I think our current information sharing and intelligence protections are very narrow and specific, and we need to be able to take a look at those and broaden them to address these types of complex incidents. Again, I think this is a natural evolution of, as we see authorities that have been put in place over the years, we need to take a step back and evaluate how do the incidents we are required to prepare for, respond to, and recover from, how are they also now included in those information sharing protections? I think it needs to be one that is mutually beneficial. We have, as I said, the private sector holds a significant amount of critical infrastructure that we rely on in public safety and in our homeland security enterprise every day to do the work that we do. To be able to integrate with them, to be able to support them and have them support us and our communities that are impacted, we need protections that I think benefit both sides of the equation. I think anytime we put emergency responders out or have individuals moving out in an area of operation, whether it's due to a natural event or one like we dealt with in Moore County, there's always a heightened risk. We take our, as well as I know our local partners here in Moore County, we take personnel accountability, and safety is really one of our top operational priorities as we start moving people around. Obviously, when you talk about a response that is not supported by power in a jurisdiction, I think those bring on some specific risks that are different from the short-term risks that we see in a natural hazard. That's something we take into account as we develop response strategies. It's something that the team here in Moore County certainly did as well. And I think it's a testament to really the work that they did in protecting their public safety personnel, that the many individuals and teams and equipment they had out moving across this jurisdiction during the response did so without major incident. That's truly a testament, I think, to their leadership and abilities here.
Thank you for that. As folks who aren't from here may have realized, we're 35 miles away from the largest Army base in the world. I'm proud to be there, Congressman. I've been working to make that installation a leader in energy security and resilience. Within fiscal year 2022 NDAA, I helped secure provision to require the Secretary of Defense. That was a funny. I did not say we're going to replace Secretary of Defense, but that's a good idea. Maybe we ought to strike that out of the record. But anyway, to require the Secretary of Defense to plan and design for military construction projects that would install an energy microgrid with intentional landing capability for at least 7 consecutive days. And in the upcoming NDAA for 2024, authorize the Secretary to construct a 10-megawatt microgrid utilizing existing and new generators at Fort Bragg, Fort Liberty. I'm excited to support this legislation through our negotiations and push for this to get over the finish line. I would ask Mr. Eistra and maybe Mr. Ray may want to jump on this too, but how would the construction of microgrids help in situations like this in terms of a quicker, getting customers back online quicker? Do you see that as a solution that we ought to pursue? Mr. Eistra, I'll ask you to start.
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for that question. The grid is very complicated and very interconnected. What I'd like to do is be able to take that question back to my team and then circle back with you.
That'd be great. And I'm out of time, but Mr. Ray, if you have a brief response.
I think anytime we can diversify and as well as integrate solutions that we're putting out into the field, I think that's going to be key, whatever the technology.
And I would just, Mr. Chairman, ask if any of the other witnesses, particularly Mr. Poncetti, this may have been more your area of expertise, but I would love a response in writing to that, your thoughts on microgrid as a solution as we look forward. I appreciate that very much. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Absolutely. We're in your territory, so definitely. I'll now go to Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for my good friend from North Carolina for having us down. Thanks for everyone for being here. We only have 5 minutes to ask questions, so I'm going to have to ask my questions quickly if I get my responses. First, one of the things that we've always been concerned about is, if information's out there, we want to make sure it's getting disseminated. And information's only as good as if it's getting shared with its partners. Mr. Ray, when I read through your testimony, I was a little bit concerned because also what you said in your testimony, but the words you used, open, honest, and transparent dialogue, is that not occurring?
So I think it is occurring within, the current structure that we have. I think it is something that we are always aware of and I think in the back of our minds. And so if there's an opportunity to strengthen or harden what those information sharing protections are, and that as we're working through the complexity of an incident response and recovery, that's something we have very clear and established, and not something we continue to
Let me follow up, because let's talk from the federal side. Do you think you're getting enough information from the federal side to make the decisions you have to make here in North Carolina?
I think we enjoy really critical partnerships with our federal family here in North Carolina. We have a state Homeland Security Advisor work group that meets monthly, and many of our federal agencies are a part of that. And so I do feel like we are supported well from our federal agencies. I think in any response, as you evaluate it, could we do things better? Certainly. And I think broadly, communication and information sharing is always going to be one of those things.
Yeah, let me just follow up real quickly, because another point you made, and you touched on it before, but by forcing states to adopt strict and specific spending targets, the funding is not effective as it can be. And again, the one thing we worry about is the one-size-fits-all coming out of Washington. What you do here in North Carolina might not work what we do in Ohio. And so, we want to make sure that we have good follow-up with you, because as we go forward, that, again, it doesn't work if it's like coming out of Washington, because oddly enough, Washington doesn't know it all. And we need to hear from the people in the states as to make these things work. Mr. Poncetti, if I could turn to you quickly. When I look through your testimony, one of the things that I'm concerned about, especially when you have your report that you issued, the top 10, when you're looking at supply chain exploitation and vulnerabilities and the extreme physical events, man-made and sabotage. Again, these are the things that we're worried about, because again, what happened here, it's not just Mother Nature anymore. And I guess my question is that if we have coordinated attack, let's go back to 9/11. The terrorists came back after trying a truck bomb. And what happens if we would have a massive attack across the country, not just isolated maybe in a state or two? What would that do to the system out there across the country? Because again, we've had testimony in committee on supply chain issues, and the supply chain is that we don't have it. And so what happens if we do have an attack like this? And again, because you're top 2 on supply chain and that exploitation of vulnerabilities, and then your number 7, the extreme physical events, either man-made sabotage and attacks. What happens? What happens to the grid?
Great question. And one of the reasons that physical cybersecurity standard, CIP 14, one of the things it does is it goes after the most, the diamonds, if you will, the most critical stations across the country, and asks each utility to go through a separate, a very precise set of assessments and say, if you have one of these diamonds in your territory, these are the protections you need to put in place. So that's worked very well so far for us. It protects it recognizes one size doesn't fit all, which has been made a couple times, but it makes sure those critical jewels, if you will, of the transmission grid are protected from cascading outages, from uncontrolled separation, and from voltage collapse or instability. So the whole grid collapsing because of that shouldn't happen, but you're going to, just like you have during a major storm, you're going to have a bunch of widespread local outages.
Let me follow up on the last 15 seconds that I have. When we have a major, like we had a wind shear in Ohio several years ago, and so we had power companies from across the country sending trucks up to Ohio to help us from the west side of the state to the east side of the state. But again, that's a state. But what happened, again, my concern is if we have a coordinated massive attack, do we have the supply chain out there to be able to meet it? Because we have a vulnerability out there. We all know, we've had a testimony in committee before on transformers, that there's only a set number there, but all of a sudden, now it's like, okay, we're going to do a triage out there to figure out who needs to get them first.
The industry works together to share equipment, and they have spares and redundancy, but certainly in a widespread attack, and you're going to face challenges. Some of these specialized equipment, like y'all saw today at West End, are long lead time items to replace. And they're specialized and specific usually for the type of substation that they're being plugged into. So that's why supply chain, it's moved to number one on our list.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I appreciate your indulgence.
I think one of the critical points you just made was the need for domestic sourcing of these critical components, and that's vital, and we've got to work on that as a nation. I'll now go to Mr. Griffith from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I represent a big chunk of Virginia north of here, and have a little piece of CERC Central Territory, and it's a huge rural district. I'm just outside of Lynchburg. I'm just outside of Roanoke. I've got South Side, part of Central, and then all of Southwest Virginia. Dr. Kern, I want to give you an opportunity because I heard something, and maybe I heard it wrong.
Yeah.
So, as understanding my district, this is why my ears picked up on this. You seem to be concerned that if we convert a large part of our fleet to electric vehicles, that in extreme weather conditions, folks like I represent in very rural areas are going to have significant mobility issues. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, I think that there's a possibility that that could happen. I think in theory, the idea of having people who have access to batteries or stored energy in their vehicles could represent a source of resiliency. But if the outages are prolonged enough and there's a limited capacity in people's vehicles, then they have a choice to make about whether they power life-saving devices in their homes or whether they get out of there.
Now let's talk about the life-saving devices too, because you're really concerned about blackouts and those types of things as well. Did I hear that in your testimony as well?
Yes, sir.
And so we need to make sure that the grid's reliable and that we have that supply chain. Mr. Poinsettia, I'm going to go to you next because, we had some definitely rolling blackouts in my district, and in part of that CERC Central, I think there were some blackouts in Kentucky during that severe weather right before Christmas. This area was dealing with the transformers that got shut up. I have to wonder how much more severe it would have been if the temperature had been 3 degrees like it was in my district on Christmas Eve. So as a part of that, let's talk transformers for a minute. I'm looking at the NERC 2023 Summer Reliability Assessment, where also that central section is on a higher, let's see, make sure I get the terminology, an elevated risk level for the summer, but it applies to the severe weather in the winter as well. We don't have enough transformers. Now, part of that, you tell me if I'm wrong, part of that was because of the increased efficiency standards set by the Department of Energy in 2013, and now they want to go again, and the report says that as far as supply chain, new efficiency standards for distribution transformers proposed by the United States Department of Energy could further exacerbate the transformer supply shortage. So, is that your assessment, that we've got a problem there?
I'm probably not the right person to comment on policy and that impact, but I do know that transformers, if they become scarce or damaged, like what happened here in Moore County, that's to fully replace it is a long lead time item. And Duke did an extraordinary job with some mobile spares and other stuff to get that power back very quickly.
And I would agree, Duke did a fantastic job, but with the new standards that came in 2013, we eliminated all but one of the American suppliers of steel for transformers, so now we're having to import that. If we have a major disaster that Mr. Latta was talking about, we're not going to have the transformers out there available. And do you think we'd be better off if we had something along the lines of the Renee Elmo's proposal of a public-private partnership to have some large distribution transformers stored at various locations around the country to make sure that if we have either a natural disaster or an attack by an enemy, that we're able to put our power grid back together in a quicker, never going to be immediate, but in a quicker time period?
So I'm a former planner and former Boy Scout, and being prepared makes good sense to me.
Tracy, do you think that Duke would be willing to participate and put some cash on the table if we could have a national public-private partnership to have transformers sitting in warehouses waiting to see if we had a disaster of some form? Yes or no, because my time's running out.
Congressman, we definitely engage in that conversation.
All right. And Mr. Ray, you indicated that some of the national priorities don't match up to help states to be more efficient. I got to know, what are they?
So I think, again, we're not in any way, shape, or form trying to minimize what I think our federal partners see at a high strategic level. We know their priorities are...
Yeah, I get it. Where do you see the problems for the state?
I think currently we don't have the flexibility to say we don't want to spend as much money on one national priority versus another that may be higher here in North Carolina. And I'm happy to...
So if we're fighting between electric vehicle chargers in rural areas or transformers, you'd like the flexibility to choose transformers. I put the words in your mouth. I also say Stafford needs to be reformed. I yield back.
All right, the gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the Crossroads of America, Indiana. Dr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. In recent years, we've obviously been confronted with just how vulnerable the grid is. Physical and cybersecurity threats, weather events, and delays in maintenance all contribute to the uncertainty for providers and ratepayers. But it's not just the electrical grid, it's all critical infrastructure, as we saw with the Colonial Oil Pipeline shutdown. Going forward, ensuring that state, local governments, and the electric industry have the necessary capabilities to prevent attacks and to coordinate, respond, and recover from grid attacks should they occur. Director Ista, I'm aware of the challenges Duke Energy has faced pertaining to the security of electrical grids and substations, as have pretty much all other providers across the nation. I think it's critically important that private companies work with governmental agencies, including law enforcement. There can be barriers. Has Duke been able to share information on this incident with law enforcement and the local agencies without the requirement for time-wasting legal paperwork or court action?
Congressman, we maintain very close relationships with our law enforcement and intelligence partners. On the specific case in Moore County, when we're going to be releasing confidential information about customers or about employees, we will require court orders or some kind of legitimate legal process.
Understood. And, we just want to make sure, obviously, there's not barriers in place that unnecessarily delay action on incidents across the country. And I understand the legal barriers can exist. I recently visited CenterPoint Energy in Houston, Texas. They have
They serve about 2 million people in the greater Houston area, but they also serve the natural gas in southern Indiana, hence was the reason I was down there. And this is a question for you, Mr. Issa, also. It was interesting to me, yet we're talking about cyber, we're talking about physical attacks, weather events, but also what they're doing for EMP, for electromagnetic pulse protection at their control station. It was actually pretty impressive. It's a new station, so they were able to, not a retrofit, this is proactively thing. Is Duke Energy looking to address EMP attacks on your stations?
Congressman, we work very closely with the Electric Power Research Institute that is doing a large-scale study on EMPs, and that is a part of our company is engaged very closely with them on that type of an attack.
Yeah, I mean, you know, up front, there's some obviously capital costs to what they did at CenterPoint in Houston, and retrofitting, you know, is would be another challenge. But I just wanted to bring that up, that EMP attacks are on the horizon and are potentially very damaging. Director Ray, in recent events pertaining to physical attacks on our nation's electrical grid, and you may have answered some of this, do you have any specific measures your department has had to change or implement to help ensure these attacks are minimized or mitigated?
So thank you for that
Specific
question.
things that you found in what you're doing that you had to reassess and adjust.
So I think over the last several years, as we've seen the evolution, as I said, of threat and risk and type of incident that we are being required to prepare for and respond to, we've had to adjust some of the partners that are at the table. I think as has been alluded to here, we, for better or for worse, have a lot of practice here in North Carolina responding to some of our natural hazard threats. Those are specific partnerships that are needed. And I think one of the tactics that we've done is really ensure that the partnerships and the partners that are in our EOC that are at the table in preparedness and response now are including those critical infrastructure sector partners as well as our law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And that's everything from their participation and engagement in preparedness work groups and planning efforts, as well as integration into our fusion centers to ensure pre-incident those right folks are at the table. That is one of the largest, I think, tactics that we've had to employ.
Great. Mr. Poncetta, could you discuss, and I only have about 30 seconds, but could you discuss how a diverse energy source mix could help bolster reliability and security for the grid?
Sure. You know, if the diversity really is key, because you need enough generation to cover not just megawatts, but all the services, the critical reliability services that are provided. So if you use a baseball analogy and say, let's go play baseball, you don't just show up with 9 pitchers. You've got to have a pitcher, a catcher. So same thing with generation. It's not just the megawatts you need. You've got to have all the other ancillary services. Traditional generation often shows up with those. New generation, you've got to plan carefully to make sure that when you take older sources off the field, that they're being replaced in kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your indulgence, I just want to say, and I'm speaking for myself, at the national level, one of the things we are trying to determine is for critical infrastructure, and I mentioned that earlier, that includes pipelines and other things. What is the role of the federal government? How do we work with our private sector partners? And it's very clear that, like the Colonial Pipeline shutdown, that there needs to be, you know, we're going to have to reassess in critical infrastructure, potentially, some of those relationships and make sure there's good coordination to prevent these attacks that could affect not only a large portion of the American people, but our national security. I yield.
Gentleman's time expired. I'll now recognize the former Bear Bryant football player from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
As I have to constantly do, correct the record, I practiced for Bear Bryant. Director Ray, on November 30th of last year, the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin warning that our nation's critical infrastructure was a potential target. Did you get that warning?
Yes, sir.
What did you do with that? Did you pass that on to Duke Energy?
So I think
No, that's a yes or no.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You passed on to Duke Energy. Mr. Astra, did you receive that warning?
We did.
What measures did you take to secure critical infrastructure?
So we get notifications like that routinely. And so we
I
have.
understand that, but there is also reported that there was an intelligence security memo detailing at least 15 instances over the course of less than a year, showing suspected extremists openly threatening and calling for acts of sabotage against the energy side, especially electricity substations. So I think when you get that many, and there was another direct warning issued by the Department of Homeland Security in January earlier, I don't think I'd consider that routine.
Sir, we will surge security resources into areas where we believe we have an increased threat. We cannot protect the thousands of substations across our jurisdictions.
I'm not talking about, I think, I'm not going to buy that, Mr. Chairman, that you can't protect them. I mean, you've got security cameras, you've got other things that, we're not talking about necessarily putting out ballistic-proof fencing or things like that. We're talking about just simple surveillance with someone sitting in an office 24/7 monitoring these facilities, because depending on the time of year, when you knock out a system for a couple of weeks or longer, it's not just about loss of business opportunity, it's talking about loss of life. I mean, we just saw a report that 68,000 people died, classified as excess winter deaths in Europe, because they can't afford their household utility bills. I can only imagine what would happen to people with cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues, that don't have power at all because you didn't do an adequate job of protecting your critical infrastructure. How do you respond to that?
So we critically understand the need for energy in our society.
Then you ought to be taking the steps necessary to protect that infrastructure. So why haven't you?
Congressman, when we get specific intelligence about increased threats in an area, we will surge security resources, work with our law enforcement and intelligence partners to do just that.
I don't think you did that. You had an attack in California. We had 2 people arrested planning attacks in Washington and Oregon. Did you know about that?
We did.
And you didn't take additional steps to secure your infrastructure. I think that's a problem.
Certainly, we briefed our teams that were in the field to be additionally vigilant.
When I was out on the substation site, I saw possibly one place where you had a closed-circuit television. The only other cameras I saw were like game trail cameras.
Sir, we have 3 trailer cameras that are deployed with 360 coverage. So they were placed strategically around that substation.
After the shooting.
Yes.
That's the problem that I have with this, Mr. Chairman, that we get these warnings, we don't know anything about them. Dr. Kern, I'd like to turn to you, following on with what my colleague from Indiana was talking about in terms of EMP. Most people think of that in terms of a human-induced attack, but you're familiar with the Carrington event, occurred in 1859, the electromagnetic storm.
Not, sir.
Well, you need to be, because Lloyd's of London takes it so seriously, sir, that they put out a report about what the estimated damage would be if we had a Carrington-level solar event. In 1859, we didn't have substations, things like that. We had telegraph wires, and they caught on fire. There was one in 1989, not near the severity of the Carrington event. Those occur about every 150, 250 years, so we're kind of in that window. In 1989, these occur about every 50 years, that knocked out power for about 6 million people. So I just think we've got to take a long, hard look about how we're securing our power bid, and also your point about changing the resource mix is the number one threat to our power grid. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I'll go to the gentlelady from Arizona who has the Palo Verde nuclear power facility. In her facility, power is important. Ms. Lesko is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you for having this field hearing, and also to Congressman Richard Hudson for talking about this. He talks about this quite a bit back in Washington, D.C. to educate us about it. I'm from the great state of Arizona, and I live in the Phoenix area. And I have to tell you, the weather here is a lot cooler than in Phoenix right now, and it's absolutely beautiful. You guys live in God country here, and I'll have to come back and visit some more. I have, my first question is for Mr. Eista, is that how you say your name?
Eista.
Eista. I noticed that at our site visit, there's a chain link fence that's around the substation, and that's the same as in Arizona as well. Do you think the security, it would be more secure if you put a block wall, a tall block wall around the perimeter of these?
Congresswoman, great question. So again, as I stated earlier, every substation is unique in its design and in its topography. In areas of Arizona, around Phoenix, it's much flatter. We get into areas of North Carolina where it's very mountainous. So you could defeat a wall simply by being up on the other side of a hill. So in this case, rather than, because we're always balancing security, reliability, and affordability. So in this case, we are looking at that substation, that subset of substations where we cannot be resilient and we cannot reroute power, and then putting the security controls in place there. Today, the threat may be from ballistics, somebody shooting. Tomorrow, the threat may be from drones, that no matter how high your wall is, they will be able to defeat it. So we believe...
I'm sorry, I have other questions, so I'm going to interrupt. Mr. Ray, what do you think? Do you think that it would improve security to have a block wall? Because, you know, a chain link fence, you can shoot right through a chain link fence. I agree, they could use drones, whatever, but you have layers of security, right? Just at my home, lights, a lock on the door, you know, cameras. Somebody could still throw a rock through my window of my front window and come in, but, you know, you try to make it as difficult as possible, right? What do you think, Mr. Ray?
So I'm certainly not a physical security expert. I would say certainly as we work with Duke and all of our partners, we're looking at layered approaches, and that's something
Okay.
the table with a lot of our partners.
My next question is for you, Mr. Ray. In this incident, did the FBI cooperate with you enough and in a timely manner?
So the investigation does not fall into our bucket. From what we had to do from a preparedness, response, and recovery standpoint and a general information and intelligence sharing standpoint, the FBI was a very good partner with us. Yes, ma'am.
And in your testimony, Mr. Ray, you talked about improving public-private cooperation, communication, honest, open, transparent. What were the problems that happened with this incident, and how could they improve?
So happy to follow up with you specifically offline. I don't want to take all of your time up for your questions, but I think there are some specific changes we could make to statute to allow us to quickly in an incident.
Specifically, I know this is sensitive, but did you get enough cooperation from Duke Energy?
As I said at the beginning, they have been a good partner of ours for many, many years as we look at all types of incidents, and we continued to enjoy that partnership during this incident as well.
Thank you. Mr. Pansetti, do you think there's enough security at substation sites? And if not, how can we improve it?
So taking that in a couple different pieces, I think from our, where we sit and what we're trying to do is protect millions from going in the dark with a cascading stability or something like the 2003 blackout.
Right.
We think the standards and the protections that are in place requiring all utilities to do that assessment and find those crown jewels that would cause one of those top three things to happen and make sure those protection measures are in place. For all the others, it's really, it's probably best served not for a federal national mandate, but for each local area to determine, do their own risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, and see what works best.
Yeah.
The chain link fence may have worked for some time, and I think everyone is reassessing.
Yeah, well, and the thing is you have to balance out the risk and how much damage it will do, right? So how much should we invest? Like, what's the catastrophic thing that's going to happen versus how much money? Because obviously, if Duke Energy or any other energy company has to put in a bunch of security. It's going to cost money. It's going to cost the ratepayers more because you're going to pass it on to the ratepayers. But is it worth it to counteract a major outage? And so I thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's been educational, and I appreciate it.
Only yields back. I'll now go to this side of the dais. Mr. Weber from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had winter, Mr. Monsetti, I'll start with you. A couple about years, 2 years, back 4 years, 2 and 4 months, we had Winter Storm Uri in Texas. Now, as you know, Texas has its own grid. We were severely impacted. It left 4.5 million homes and businesses without power, an average of around 42 hours, some up to 120 hours. And although this was extremely rare for Texas, we are no strangers on the Gulf Coast where I live to hurricanes and tropical storms that tear through our district there with tremendous power and destruction. What recommendations, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but let me get to the second one before I ask you to respond. Do you have to ensure the reliability of the electric grid, not only from traditional weather effects, obviously, but for rare occurrences such as Uri? My second question is, do you think redundancy is the key? Now, I know that this means more money for taxpayers, where you build additional generation capacity at each site. Your answer. Yes, sir. Don't look at him, you got to answer it.
Thanks for that question. So, very familiar with that storm and the effects of it. And, the aftermath of that, I think we've got some upgraded standards that are now taking effect. And one of the key things, it's been mentioned a couple places, is preparation. And in this case, winter preparation, making sure from the pipelines to the generating units to certainly the transmission system are properly protected and winter weatherized for such an event.
But we do need some redundancy, don't we? Because the American population is growing. And not only is the American population growing, more drivers on the street, and now there's going to be more electric vehicles on the street. And by the way, just tongue-in-cheek, I saw a survey the other day that said 90% of electric vehicles are still on the highway. The other 10% made it home safely. So we want to be mindful that we are going to need more generation capacity. So I'll go back to, I know this is tough for Duke, but it means that we ought to have more capacity at every turn. Wouldn't you agree? Some redundancy there? A backup, so if one system goes down, we have a backup.
So agree with redundancy, and the system is built with that redundancy. It's built to be resilient, and one of the requirements is that everyone that's operating the grid, in every specific second of the day, they've got to withstand the next worst contingency. But when you have two, in this case, you had two worst contingencies immediately happening, sometimes you're not able to recover from those two worst contingencies.
Well, I would also argue for nuclear energy along with these guidelines as well. Mr. Asta, I think I wanted to go back to. After the attack here in Moore County, we heard a question from Congressman Palmer about what steps did y'all take. I want to move over to the new federal regulation proposed that now they're going to start requiring material switching, grain-oriented electric steel GOES as the acronym, to amorphous steel for these transformers. Are y'all following that?
Yes, sir.
Is that going to be good or bad?
Sir, we all know that our transformer supply chain is strained now. Last year alone, Duke Energy installed over 70,000 distribution transformers, and we're on track to do 5% more than that in 2023. The new energy efficiency standards will further exacerbate those supply chain struggles.
Have you written your president about that? No pressure.
No, sir.
No pressure. As I understand it, the material that they are pressing for is an amorphous metal, a solid metallic metal, using an alloy with disordered atomic scale structure. Most metals are crystalline in their solid state, which means they have a highly ordered arrangement of atoms. Actually, what they're requiring is the opposite of that. Amorphous metals are non-crystalline and have a glass-like structure. Is this going to be a problem? I mean, suppose you could get to the supply chains and you could get those transformers. Is this type of metal going to be a problem in transformers?
Sir, I can tell you our manufacturers are concerned about it because it is often foreign sourced, and being able to get it to build the transformers will be difficult. So we will stand behind or agree with our manufacturers that although energy efficiency is a good thing eventually, right now is not the time.
Yeah, well, I hope y'all are making that known. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and now go to the gentleman from Augusta, Georgia, home of Vogel Nuclear Station, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, for allowing me to join the Energy, Climate, and Grid Security Subcommittee here today. And I want to thank my friend Congressman Hudson for hosting us here in his home state of North Carolina. As Chairman Duncan said, I'm from Augusta, home of the Masters Golf Tournament. And I am extremely excited that the U.S. Open is going to be returning to your community next year. Hint, hint, Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson. Getting serious here, cybersecurity is critical for grid resiliency. I am proud that adjacent to my district is the Savannah River site located in the chairman's home state of South Carolina, which we work together all the time in. SRS has a robust electric grid that was built to sustain a number of key national security functions during Cold War operations at the site. Savannah River National Lab, located at SRS, is leveraging this grid to conduct research and develop for grid security. One of the key pieces of this grid infrastructure at SRS is a 17-mile isolated loop section of 115 kV electrical transmission line. SRNL has proposed use of this section of line to conduct proof of principle testing of advanced security devices such as acoustic sensors that detect anomalies of the grid. Data from these anomalies can be sent to operations centers to evaluate potential threats and risks to our system. Unfortunately, we live in a dangerous world. And today, where we have soft targets, we have got to harden those targets. Mr. Aste, the DOE National Lab System has technical capabilities and tools to address needed research in grid security. The Savannah River Site National Lab, as mentioned, has a strong background in grid testing and data analytics that partnered with utilities and industry and help facilitate rapid analysis and decision-making of grid and cyber security efforts. Mr. Astor, has Duke engaged with any DOE laboratories on research and development investments to enhance grid and cyber security efforts?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Congressman. We work closely with the Department of Energy and several of the different national laboratories.
Where do you stand as far as updating hardening your systems based on their research and development?
And we will take the R&D done by the DOE and we will apply it and vet it to see if it's appropriate for our system.
After 9/11, it was determined that attack could have been prevented if we had had local, state, and federal law enforcement talking to each other. Mr. Ray, as far as, and of course, we created this huge department now called Homeland Security to make sure that our homeland is secure. I'm real disappointed that we haven't found the perpetrators of this, and I'm not sure that we're making the efforts to do that. Does your office have any comment on, and I know we can't talk about the investigation, but is this investigation going the way you think it should go?
So thank you for that question, Congressman. I think the investigation is not something that is under our purview. It's not something that our office is engaged in as far as managing the investigation from a law enforcement standpoint. I will tell you, to your point, I think you highlight an important construct of the the partnership at multiple levels in law enforcement, intelligence, and public safety. It's something we are continuing to strive here in North Carolina to continue to implement, expand, and make better. We have a robust statewide information sharing platform among law enforcement and other public safety agencies. And again, we're always committed to trying to make sure that that's providing actionable operational intelligence to those that are at the very lowest level, boots on the ground, responding as quickly as possible. But as far as any comment about the investigation, I certainly can't make any at this point.
Well, you know, our goal here is to protect, obviously, national security and protecting the American people is goal one, and it should be, particularly of this Congress and of our conference. And so we need to make sure this does not happen again. There were people that were harmed in this and suffered financially, and I heard there may have been one death, maybe not knowing what caused it. We've got to up our game here. I mean, we obviously know we got problems at the border, and we know why. And, of course, we're going to deal with the Department of Homeland Security. Our conference will do that. But these are the kind of things that we need to get better. We got to stop this. And you have our full cooperation to make it happen. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. That concludes really the question and answer portion, and some members do have some written questions that they will submit, which is ask you to return those within 10 business days. We traveled so far, and this is an important hearing. I'm going to give members, if there's a critical question you'd like to ask right now while we're here, let's just make it brief, and I'll give members an opportunity to do that if you'd like. So I'm going to go to Bhushan first.
I just want to make a follow-up quick statement. As far as the transformers goes, there's only one company that makes electrical steel for transformers that left in the United States. That's AK Steel. And most of it is, all the rest of it's imported. When I was at Centerpoint, as I mentioned, I talked about the EMP stuff. I didn't talk about if some of their big transformers go down, 2-year turnaround to replace them. So I just want to point that out. We have a supply chain issue in this industry. I yield.
Yeah, great point. Mr. Griffin.
And on the transformers, just quickly, I would say that the 2 years is important. We probably should have mentioned that earlier, which is why one of the reasons why we need to figure out somehow, and maybe it's private industry, maybe it's a combination, how we can have a supply built up, because it does take a long time to build some of these larger transformers. Mr. Ray, you talked about Stafford a little bit in your opening. I'd like for you to expand on that, because one of my concerns with Stafford, we went down as a part of this, I think it was this subcommittee a number of years ago, went down to Puerto Rico after they got hit by 2 hurricanes in a row, and we went to the Virgin Islands. And one of the interesting things that I saw was on the Virgin Islands, they had 10 poles that didn't have to be replaced, and they were all composite. But the Stafford Act, Mr. Chairman, won't let us replace with a better product. We have to replace with the same product. So in order to, our federal dollars went to putting in new wooden poles, even though we know that isn't what works in that condition. So I was wondering if you had some similar concerns with Stafford in North Carolina.
I think you hit on one of the important topics. I think there's some work to do around Stafford, and I don't want to take up the entire committee's time by going through the list that we have, and we're happy to follow up with you. And maybe
I can do a written question and you give me a more detailed answer on that.
But I think both from a program delivery, from a recovery standpoint, from an incident type, and as well as some of the issues that you just mentioned, it's a complex issue that I think we need to take a hard look at if we're going to look at making sure we have the needed capabilities ready to respond to support our local jurisdictions across this nation.
And I will tell you also, Mr. Chairman, in regard to the FEMA, which falls in that same arena, both senators in Virginia who are Democrats and myself are looking at ways we can help, because it doesn't seem to be skewed correctly for disasters that occur in rural areas. I yield back.
Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just briefly, because one of the things also to point out from the CERC Top 10 regional risks is something that we're dealing with all over, is your point number 3 in the shortage of required skill sets. you know, in Ohio, I've been to a lot of meetings. We've talked about it, and also in Washington. How are we going to get more people in these skill sets? Because, again, when you got 1.9 jobs per person right now, we got a problem. So when the lights go out, somebody's got to go out there and get it done. But how are we going to get these people trained and get them in these jobs?
Good point. Mr. Allen, last comment?
Yes, I just wanted to comment on cybersecurity. Fort Gordon is in Augusta, located in Augusta as well, and that's the Cyber Center of Excellence for the United States Army. Obviously, there was a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline. Where are we? And I'd like to know, Mr. Einsler, as far as Duke Power and where you are with cybersecurity, and are we, again, working with military and others about those types of attacks?
Yes, Congressman, we are. There are several of us with security clearances in the company. We receive classified briefings on a routine basis from the intelligence community. We have a robust 24/7 monitoring capability, and we have an industry sharing, a robust industry sharing to be able to protect both our IT and our OT assets.
Mr. Ray?
Yes, sir. So I think you hit an important topic. And here in North Carolina, we are fortunate. We've had some leadership over the last several years that has acknowledged that we need to do more in the cyber space as we talk about having resources to both prepare and respond. And so I think we're very proud to be a part of the state's Joint Cyber Task Force here in North Carolina. The four primary agencies are the North Carolina National Guard, obviously our organization, as well as the Department of Information Technology and our local government information systems staff. Additionally, the wider intelligence and federal law enforcement community is a part of that task force as well. We actually have a cyber mission center that has been stood up at our state EOC within the last couple of years, and so we as an agency are taking some hard steps into both proactive work. How are we preparing how are we helping end users prepare their systems to take necessary steps, as well as having boots on the ground to be able to put into a jurisdiction or agency that is experiencing some sort of incident or disruption. That is always a capability that we're certainly looking to expand, but very proud of that group.
Mr. Ponsetto, anything you would like to add?
One of the things that NERC does, you heard it mentioned a couple of times, sharing of the information quickly and getting ahead of it, especially if there is coordinated attacks, is important. And NERC has a 24/7 electric sector EISAC, information sharing analysis communications, and they put out information daily on both cyber and physical attacks that quickly alerts the industry that are members of that to be prepared and have a heads up.
Dr. Kern, anything you'd like to add?
No.
Okay. One other comment I'd like to make here is when I became a member of Congress, one thing I learned in every county I represent, 23 counties, if I wanted to know what was going on in that county, I called my sheriff. Your law enforcement officials know everything that's going on. They know a lot more than the FBI and other state law enforcement. Please work with our local law enforcement people and cooperate with them more, because they get frustrated. Law enforcement somewhat frustrated anyway. But y'all, they're a tremendous resource. And like I said, nothing goes on in this county that your sheriff doesn't know about. I can guarantee you that. Thank you, Sheriff.
Let's take an opportunity to thank all the law enforcement folks in the room and what you do. To my gentleman's point, Duke Energy and Clemson University have a drivetrain facility where they test a lot of the grid components to address some of the things you're talking about. I invite members to go down and see that in Charleston at some point. This concludes the hearing. I'm going to let my fellow colleague from North Carolina wrap it up for us, and when he finishes his thank yous, we'll stand adjourned.
You're saying it's me stand between you and lunch, so I'll be brief. Hey, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our witnesses. And we look forward to your written responses to some of the questions. And look, today's the beginning of the conversation. This is, we're going to continue to communicate with you and rely on you to help us understand the challenges you're facing. You know, our job now is to take this information and figure out what steps are next. What can we do to help? You know, we're not law enforcement. We're not going to go out and find this perpetrator, but there may be things we can do to help the sheriff and others get the kind of cooperation they need to do that. You know, we're not emergency response folks, but there may be things we can do to help give you better authorities, more flexibility, so you can do a better job of responding to these type of incidents. But we also have a responsibility to this country to look at this incident and ask the question, what does this tell us about the larger vulnerabilities of our grid? What does this tell us about the possibilities not only of this happening again, but maybe something worse happening again if we don't do a better job of preparing this country through supply chain, through redundancy, resiliency. And so, you know, we've got a big responsibility before us, and I'm just proud of the members of this committee and thankful that you know, I have been talking about this a lot, but I'm just not talking in the wind. I'm talking to colleagues who care and have the expertise to address this. And again, this is the first of many, I think, hearings and activities we'll do to address this. I do want to mention two bills, since my colleagues brought it up. I have the bill Protecting America's Distribution Transfer Supply Chain Act. Hopefully everybody here will co-sponsor it, but it repeals the Secretary's authority to enforce any energy efficient standards for these distribution transformers for the next 5 years. So we need a halt on this new efficiency standards, particularly with the situation we're facing now with transformer supply chain. And then 21st Century Jobs Act is a bill I've gotten passed out of the House for 3 Congresses now, and we'd love to have the Senate take it up, but it has the Secretary of Energy work with the education system to prepare our students for the jobs of the 21st century in the energy industry, whether it's line workers, whether it's building transformers, nuclear engineers, whatever those jobs are going to be in the future. I want to make sure we're training our workforce to be prepared for those jobs. So but again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing the committee here. Thank you for y'all's serious attention to this, and I look forward to moving forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stand adjourned.